They didn't behead him. They didn't poison him. They locked him in a wooden chest and left him to die. Naked, starving, screaming. Prince Sado of Korea was the crown prince, the son of a Confucian king, and a man tormented by madness or by politics. For 8 days, the court listened to his dying breath, and when silence came, they erased his name. In the bitter chill of February 1735, under the gilded ceilings of Changdeokgung Palace, the drums of royal announcement echoed across the courtyards like thunder contained. A declaration not of joy, but of duty fulfilled. Prince Yi Seon had been born, and with his arrival came the restoration of hope to a dynasty haunted by child mortality and political instability. The kingdom celebrated not because a baby had arrived, but because a vessel for continuity had taken its first breath. And so the silk banners unfurled, the court bowed, and the people lit incense. Not for the child, but for the survival of the crown he would one day be forced to wear. He was not simply the son of King Yongjo. He was the only surviving son after a string of royal losses that had left the throne vulnerable to factional ambition and ancestral shame. A singular flame lit in a long corridor of shadows, expected to burn brightly against the cold winds of internal court politics and external threats. But in the cold, glittering splendor of the royal nursery, wrapped in brocade and ceremony, Yi Seon received no lullabies from his mother, no warm touch from his father, no private tenderness unmeasured by propriety. For King Yongjo, a ruler molded by Confucian absolutism and terrorized by the memory of illegitimacy, had no space in his heart for affection, not when raising a king required discipline, distance, and an almost surgical suppression of feeling. Lady Yongbin, Sado's mother, a woman elevated by royal favor, but still trembling under the weight of her own low birth and palace hierarchy, remained quietly dutiful, present, obedient, never daring to defy the unspoken rule that a prince was to be shaped by formality, not love. And so, from his earliest days, Yi Seon was cradled by expectation, but not by arms, observed, but not known, praised publicly, but corrected in silence, his world a pristine garden where even birdsong sounded like an order. Every milestone of his infancy, the first words, the first steps, the first time he grasped a calligraphy brush, was not celebrated with parental pride, but documented like royal inventory, a checkmark in the scroll of succession. And behind every court smile was the unspoken pressure: be perfect or be erased. By the age of 5, he had already begun formal training in Confucian ethics, calligraphy, history, and classics, not taught like stories to inspire, but delivered like commandments carved in stone, with failure greeted not with guidance, but with frowns that felt heavier than any beating could ever be. And when he stumbled, as all children do, he did not find the comfort of a father's patience, but the sharpened disappointment of a monarch who had seen too many sons buried, too many dreams betrayed, and too many ministers waiting like vultures for weakness to justify a change in lineage. King Yongjo did not scream. He did not strike, but he looked away, and that quiet absence was far more brutal than any punishment. For in a world built on hierarchy and ritual, being unseen by the king was equivalent to death before burial. The boy tried harder. He studied longer. He memorized not just passages, but the tone with which they were to be recited, the pauses expected after certain characters, the posture deemed appropriate when referencing ancient sages. And still, it was not enough. The royal tutors reported progress, but the king always wanted more. More discipline, more perfection, more signs that his son could one day rule without error, without scandal, without tears. And in that relentless push for flawlessness, the boy's spirit began to bend, not break, not yet, but bend in ways unseen, in corners of the mind where expectations harden into fear, and fear crystallizes into something darker. His playtime was supervised. His meals were regulated. His speech was monitored. Even his dreams, it seemed, had to align with court doctrine. He was told what to admire, what to fear, whom to trust, and most dangerously, whom not to speak to, lest his budding mind absorb the wrong ideology, the wrong influence, the wrong scent of rebellion. But what no one considered, what no one dared to ask, was this. What happens to a child raised like a statue, sculpted but never embraced, praised but never loved? At night, when the corridors fell silent and only the flickering of lanterns remained, the young prince would often wake from dreams he could not name, drenched in sweat, heart racing, his mind filled with scenes of drowning, of running, of being judged by faceless elders. He once asked a nursemaid if even emperors were allowed to cry. She did not answer. Instead, she bowed and left the room, because even a tear from a prince was considered a political act. And so, he cried alone, in silence, under layers of silk that warmed his skin, but never reached his heart. By the time he turned 10, Yi Xion had learned one lesson more thoroughly than any analects of Confucius. Love was conditional, and silence was safer. The golden cage around him had no visible bars, but its locks were forged from ritual, from bloodline, from history too heavy for a boy's shoulders. And the more he grew, the more that weight began to show. Not in rebellion, not yet, but in the way he held his brush too tightly, the way his hands trembled before exams, the way he paused just slightly before saying, "Father," as though uncertain if he had the right to speak the word. To the outside world, he was the ideal heir, intelligent, dutiful, humble, and quiet. But inside, within the walls of the prince's chambers, a different truth was beginning to stir. A quiet cracking in the foundation, a subtle shift in the gaze, a mind beginning to divide itself into masks it could wear and fears it could not name. The perfect heir had been born in winter, and like all things buried in frost, something beneath had begun to freeze, not from failure, not from weakness, but from the aching absence of warmth that even kings cannot command. There is a particular kind of pain that does not scream, does not break bones or draw blood, but slowly hollows a person out from within, replacing breath with dread, confidence with second-guessing, and identity with the endless echo of not enough. And for Prince Yi Xion, that pain took the form of his father's eyes, cold and unreadable, watching him from the throne like a scholar judging a flawed manuscript. By the age of 12, the boy was no longer merely learning. He was performing, a puppet draped in royal silk, forced to recite the 5 virtues not as a lesson, but as an incantation that might summon approval from a man who wielded love like a blade and affection like a state secret. The study hall, once a place for childhood curiosity, became a chamber of silent terror, where mistakes were not corrected but recorded, where tutors spoke with dry precision and scribes noted down every hesitation, every mispronounced syllable, every glance downward as signs of moral failing or spiritual weakness. Because under Confucian doctrine, even posture could be a reflection of inner rot. It was in that suffocating atmosphere of surveillance, silence, and ceremonial restraint that the first cracks in his mind began to form. Hairline fractures at first, invisible to those too busy evaluating his potential to notice the weight slowly pressing against the boy's soul from within. He began to dread mornings, not because he was lazy, but because every dawn brought another day of walking a tightrope strung between filial piety and psychological collapse. And he knew, deeply, instinctively, that the price of slipping would not be a gentle hand to lift him, but a wall of silence from a father who never once embraced him in private. There were days when the prince vomited before stepping into the study hall. Days when his hands shook so violently that he spilled ink across his texts, staining the pages like tiny silent screams. Evidence not just of nerves, but of the unbearable tension between his identity as a son and his role as a symbol. No one dared name it. No one used the word fear. But it lingered like smoke in the corners of every corridor he walked, clinging to his robes, threading itself through his thoughts, whispering to him that one day, one misstep would end everything. The servants began to whisper behind closed doors about how the prince flinched when the king's footsteps echoed too close, about how he sometimes wandered the gardens, muttering to himself, about how he would stare at the moon for hours, lips moving in prayer or protest, no one could tell which. But inside the palace, where image was survival and perception was policy, those whispers were buried beneath formal reports that described the prince as studious, composed, and earnest. Euphemisms that betrayed the truth without ever acknowledging it. To the court, the boy remained a symbol. To his father, he remained a disappointment. And to himself, he was becoming a stranger. The breaking point did not come in a sudden, dramatic collapse. It arrived as a series of small humiliations, each seemingly minor, but together forming a chorus of shame that chipped away at what little self-worth he still clung to. Like the time he misquoted a Confucian passage and the king refused to speak to him for 3 days. Or when he hesitated before answering a minister's question and was later scolded for dishonoring the family line. In these moments, something in Yi Seon began to turn, not away from his father, but inward, like a flower folding into itself under frost, retreating to some hidden core where at least the voice of self-loathing could be controlled, if not silenced. He grew quieter, not out of discipline, but out of caution. He smiled more, not out of joy, but because he had learned that smiling delayed judgment. He bowed lower, studied longer, and tried harder, believing desperately that if he could just be perfect for long enough, the tide might turn, the silence might thaw, and the man who sat on the throne might finally see a son, not a project, but perfection, like the throne itself, was a poisoned crown. And as Yi Seon poured himself into ritual and reading, mastering the gestures of obedience so well that even the court historians called him exemplary, he began to lose something deeper, his sense of self, his sense of realness, his ability to cry without apology or speak without calculation. He was becoming hollow. Not a prince, not a boy, but an echo of what everyone else needed him to be. And it was in this void, this growing emptiness between his soul and his title, that the whispers in his mind began to grow louder. At first, they came at night, half-dreamed voices calling his name, the phantom footsteps of courtiers who had never wronged him but now felt like enemies, the gnawing fear that the palace itself was conspiring to trap him in a narrative he could no longer control. Later, they came during the day. Flashes of heat when he held a brush. Sudden nausea when reading aloud. The urge to tear the silk from his body because it felt like a costume he could no longer tolerate wearing. He began to ask questions, strange, circular ones, about the stars, about justice, about whether a son could be both loyal and terrified. The tutors, bound by protocol, did not answer. The father, bound by image, did not listen. And the mother, bound by fear, remained silent. The fracture had deepened. Not yet madness, not yet violence, but something worse: invisibility. Because in a court built on appearances, the deepest cruelty is not punishment, but dismissal. And so, Yi Seon, the boy born beneath banners and drums, began to fade behind the very curtain he had been raised to inherit, his mind unraveling quietly, politely, beneath the weight of robes too heavy for a heart too hollow. It began, as such things often do, not with screams or spectacles, but with whispers behind closed doors and glances exchanged across lacquered floors. Small, almost imperceptible changes in behavior that palace attendants first mistook for eccentricity, then for spiritual sensitivity, and finally, with increasing dread, for the first signs of something they dared not name aloud. At 15, Prince Yi Seon no longer looked like a boy trying to impress his father. He looked like a ghost rehearsing his own disappearance, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, voice too soft or too sharp with no middle ground, as if the very act of speaking required crossing a battlefield of doubt and hallucination. He began to avoid reflections, then suddenly became obsessed with them, standing before polished bronze mirrors for hours, whispering to his own image, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, always with the intensity of a man fighting someone no one else could see. Until one night, when his chamberlain found him on the floor, surrounded by shattered mirror shards, muttering that the devil had tried to climb out of his face. From that night forward, silence no longer surrounded the prince. It recoiled from him. Servants who had once admired his diligence now asked to be reassigned. Guards who once bowed with deference now did so with hesitation, unsure whether the sword at his side was ceremonial or meant for something far more immediate and personal. The rituals he once followed with reverent precision became scattered, then erratic, and then grotesquely parodied. He declared himself the Emperor of Heaven, demanded dragon robes normally reserved only for the reigning king, and refused to eat unless the rice had been offered to the spirits of the dead, which he insisted visited him nightly in the form of pale women with empty eyes. His rooms filled with drawings, hundreds of them, scrawled on scrolls, parchment, silk, even the walls, all of them depicting dragons, blood, hands without fingers, suns eclipsed by dark clouds, and his own name written over and over until the ink bled through the paper and left stains on the wooden floors that could not be scrubbed away. Sometimes he appeared in the throne room barefoot and shirtless, carrying a sword with red paint, or perhaps not paint, on the blade, speaking in riddles, accusing ministers of conspiracies no one understood, then laughing for minutes without pause, his head tilted back like a marionette whose strings had been jerked by a cruel god. Other times he disappeared into the palace gardens for entire nights, emerging only at dawn, soaked in dew and sometimes in blood, his eyes wide, his hands shaking, whispering about voices in the trees and a dragon in the pond who promised him immortality if he only killed the right person. What had once been the tremble of a frightened child had evolved into the tremble of a man at war with his own mind. And in that transformation, something essential, something protective, had broken beyond repair. He began to kill. At first it was animals, birds, cats, palace dogs, slaughtered in silence or in fits of rage, their bodies hidden or displayed depending on his mood. But always with the same strange look in his eyes, not of satisfaction, but of confusion, as if he could not tell whether he had just ended a life or cleansed a vision. Then it was servants, thrown downstairs for imagined insults, beaten to death with ceremonial staffs, or in one particularly infamous incident, strangled with a sash while the prince recited verses from a funeral rite, pausing only to correct the rhythm of his own chanting. He raped court women, sometimes in full view of others, sometimes in private chambers that had once been reserved for meditation and study. And when confronted by ministers or relatives, he responded not with shame, but with scripture, twisting Confucian language into justification. His eyes glazed, his tone eerily calm, as if quoting an ancient truth absolved him of modern horror. He beat his sister when she asked him to stop. He accused his mother of poisoning his thoughts. He threatened to set the palace on fire because the shadows in his room wouldn't leave him alone. Lady Hyeogyung, his wife and witness to it all, recorded the unraveling with the clarity of someone forced to watch a loved one disintegrate while holding her own sanity together with threadbare hope and biting ink. She did not flinch in her writing, nor excuse his crimes. But neither did she strip him of humanity, instead preserving in her memoir a man who wept after killing, who collapsed after raging, who whispered apologies to his son as though trying to claw his way back into the light even as the darkness consumed him. In her words, Yi Seon was not simply a monster or a madman. He was a prince whose heart had been slowly broken by isolation, whose mind had been allowed to rot beneath the weight of ceremonial obedience, and whose final acts of violence were not born from cruelty, but from desperation, from a fractured identity that no one had dared to mend. The court, however, did not read poetry into the blood on the palace tiles. They saw only danger. They heard the rumors of severed heads kicked like balls down lotus paths, of stolen garments used to disguise himself during midnight prowls, of laughter that echoed through the night like a curse no prayer could erase. And they began to whisper again, not of eccentricity or prophecy this time, but of removal, of silence, of a solution that would keep the king's hands clean and the throne intact. For if madness had worn a commoner's face, it would have been buried without a second thought. But madness, when clothed in royal silk and framed in lineage, posed a threat not just to lives, but to legitimacy. And so the royal household turned in on itself, like a body trying to expel a tumor without leaving a scar. The boy who had once trembled before ink now made others tremble with his footsteps. The heir who had once been cherished in theory had become a curse in practice. And as the palace lights dimmed and his name began to vanish from public prayers, Prince Yi Seon, now called Sado, privately, cautiously, stood alone in robes that no longer fit, wearing the crown of a man who had never taught him how to wear it, and waiting, without knowing it, for the sentence that would end not just his reign, but his name. There comes a moment in every slow descent when a line is crossed so quietly, so seamlessly, that no one sees it happen until it is too late to turn back. When a mind already cracked begins to shatter, not in isolation, but in full view, bleeding into the walls, the routine, the lives around it, until the palace itself begins to recoil in dread from its own prince. By the time Yi Seon reached his early 20s, no one referred to him as the heir with pride anymore. Not the ministers who once toasted his birth, not the tutors who once praised his diligence, not even the servants who once bowed with genuine deference. Because now, the only question that mattered was not whether he would become king, but whether he would kill someone else before the sun set. He no longer hid his outbursts. He no longer pretended to meditate when the Spirit spoke to him or to consult texts when his rage surged through his limbs like wildfire. He acted, without apology and often without warning, turning once sacred halls into chambers of terror, where a misplaced glance or a slow reply could mean a beating, a lashing, or, in the worst moments, death. His favorite targets were eunuchs, Men he seemed to see as both less than and somehow guilty of betraying some cosmic balance he could not articulate. Beaten until bones snapped. Sometimes with ceremonial staffs, sometimes with lacquered scroll boxes, sometimes with his own bare fists, which he would later wrap in silk and leave stained in crimson like trophies of half-remembered justice. The court ladies fared no better. He would summon them under false pretenses, requests for tea, for scripture readings, for companionship, and then descend into rages that ended with torn garments, bruised limbs, and broken silence. Their screams muffled not just by fear, but by the absolute futility of protest in a palace where their voices meant nothing against a prince's madness. Sometimes he struck them. Sometimes he raped them. Sometimes he simply held them and cried, whispering apologies even as his hands trembled with unresolved fury. As if somewhere deep within him, a sliver of conscience still blinked in horror at what he had become. But that sliver, whatever it was, never lasted long. And the cycle always returned. Once, when his sister scolded him after he assaulted one of her attendants, he slapped her across the face so violently that she bled from the mouth, and then wept, not because he had harmed her, but because he believed she had turned into a demon trying to poison his food. Another time, when a court musician played a melody he found irritating, he ordered the man's instrument broken and had him beaten in front of the entire staff, pacing around the scene as if conducting a symphony of his own wrath. But the worst, the moment that hardened the whispers into open horror, came not in private, but in the Lotus Garden, once his mother's favorite place for prayer. He had ordered a servant executed for spilling ink on a ceremonial robe. There had been no trial, no message to the king, no official charge, only a command and a sword. And when the man's head rolled across the stone path, Sado laughed, not with cruelty, but with the stunned, breathless awe of a child discovering that the world truly bends under his will. Then, like a boy lost in some twisted game, he kicked the severed head down the garden path, chasing it between the lotus ponds as if it were a ball from his childhood. Oblivious, or perhaps uncaring, that several women were watching from the adjacent corridor, their hands pressed over their mouths, their bodies frozen in absolute, wordless terror. The ministers could no longer pretend. The attendants could no longer lie. Lady Hae-gyung, who had for years carried his secrets like sacred burdens, began to write, her brush trembling not with hatred, but with the unbearable weight of witnessing a man she once called husband becoming a specter of violence she could no longer contain. In her memoirs, she recorded it all, not just the acts themselves, but the moments in between, the silent collapses, the panic attacks, the sudden tenderness that flickered after cruelty like the sun behind a storm cloud, as if part of Yi Seon still believed, somehow, that he was not beyond saving. She wrote of how he screamed after killing, how he avoided the gaze of his own son, how he asked her, once, if she thought he had been cursed from birth, or whether the curse had entered through the ink of royal expectations. And still, no one stopped him. The court held emergency meetings behind closed doors, debating whether to declare him unfit, whether to strip him of succession rights, whether to force King Yeongjo's hand. But Confucian law made such discussions dangerous, even blasphemous. For to denounce a prince was to suggest that the king had failed, and in a system where filial order mirrored the divine, no minister wished to be the first to whisper that heaven had turned its face away. So they waited. Waited for a breaking point. Waited for the king to see what they saw. Waited for something, anything, that would allow them to remove the dagger from the heart of the court without severing the entire body. But Yi Seon kept walking. He wandered the palace barefoot, sometimes naked, dragging blood-streaked silk behind him, his eyes wide, his speech fragmented, speaking of demons in the ceiling and gods in the dust, sometimes gentle, sometimes murderous, sometimes both in the span of a single sentence. And no matter how many crimes he committed, no one dared touch him. Because he was still the prince, because he was still the son of the king. Because in Joseon, a crown was not just a symbol, it was a shield, a weapon, and a prison all at once. And so, the blood in the lotus garden dried in the summer sun. The servants scrubbed the stones, the women wept in silence, the ministers prepared their scripts, and somewhere deep within the palace walls, a mother lit incense in the dark, praying not for her son's redemption, but for a decision. Because mercy by then had become far more dangerous than death. King Yongjo had ruled for decades with a clarity of vision sharpened by paranoia, strengthened by ritual, and protected by a moral philosophy so strict, so absolute, that it left no room for personal grief, no space for softness, no allowance for the kinds of cracks that love might pry open in a mind obsessed with order and legacy. And so when his only surviving son descended into chaos, the king did not cry, did not scream, did not crumble. He turned away. For a ruler raised in the unforgiving doctrine of Neo-Confucianism, where hierarchy was divinely ordained and filial piety was not a virtue, but a commandment written into the architecture of the universe, there could be no greater shame than to admit that the heir to his throne, the living extension of his lineage, his policies, his blood, had become a threat not just to palace decorum, but to the very concept of moral government itself. To say it aloud would be to indict himself. To intervene would be to unravel the illusion of sacred harmony upon which his entire reign had been built. And so, he did what many men of power do when confronted with an unfixable fracture in the thing they love most. He denied it by degrees, avoided it with ritual, buried it beneath layers of silence, protocol, and administrative distance, as though bureaucracy could replace the bonds between father and son, and as though the absence of action might somehow erase the presence of disaster. At court, he maintained composure, reading reports that grew darker by the week, each one detailing new acts of violence, new witnesses, new rumors, new pleas for intervention, and yet he responded with cold detachment, neither confirming nor denying, neither scolding nor saving, instead sending down cryptic edicts that praised balance and demanded discretion, as if language alone could redirect the tide of madness consuming his son. To his ministers, he was unmoved. To his concubines, he was unreadable. To himself, perhaps, he was unforgiven. When a court eunuch begged for reassignment, citing Prince Sado's erratic behavior and violent outbursts, Yongjo ordered the request to be denied without explanation. When a high official asked whether the prince should be sent away for treatment, the king rebuked the question, not with anger, but with such calm disdain that the room chilled, and the subject was never raised again. And when Lady Hyekyung, desperate and breaking under the weight of her husband's unraveling mind, tried to deliver a letter begging for intervention, not as a subject, but as a daughter-in-law, as a mother, as someone pleading not for politics, but for mercy, the king left the letter unopened on his desk for 3 days, then returned it with no seal, no signature, no message. The silence was deliberate, because to speak would be to engage, and to engage would be to admit that something sacred had failed. But failure for Yongjo was not an option he could afford. Not after having risen from the ashes of royal illegitimacy. Not after consolidating power in a court torn apart by factions. Not after surviving the deaths of so many children and finally producing one who, for a brief window in time, had seemed capable of carrying forward the dream of righteous monarchy. He had built his reign on discipline, on composure, on the belief that moral clarity could heal a fractured nation. And now to acknowledge the corruption of his own son would be to call that entire foundation into question, to risk the legitimacy of the very system that had sustained him. So he chose distance, he chose posture, he chose the law. And the law, bound as it was to Confucian principles, offered a perverse shield, because while a king had the power to kill a traitor, he did not have the right to kill a son, not without invoking cosmic disorder, not without challenging the heaven-mandated roles that defined all life in Joseon. To execute Sado would be to violate the natural order. To forgive him would be to risk the state. To exile him would be to show weakness. And to do nothing, well, that was not inaction. That was a decision dressed in robes. One day, in a gesture that shattered what little hope still flickered in Lady Hyekyung's heart, the king returned Sado's ceremonial clothing, folded with care, but delivered without a message, without a word, without a servant to explain whether the act was symbolic or final, whether it was an offer of reconciliation or a silent declaration of abandonment. To the courtiers, it was clear. The king had turned his face away. The ministers grew restless. Rumors surged like wildfire through the stone corridors that the prince had summoned spirits into the women's quarters, that he had sacrificed a dog in the prayer hall, that he had threatened to kill his own son if he cried too loudly. Each tale more grotesque than the last. Each one whispered with urgency, but never written down, never formally acknowledged, never raised during council meetings, because the kingdom was frozen in a paradox. The man who posed the greatest threat to its survival was the very one they were required by law and ritual to protect. Youngjo, now aging and increasingly isolated, found himself cornered by his own beliefs. He could not pass the crown to a madman, but neither could he destroy the man who wore it by birthright. And so the court waited for a crack in the law, for an accident of timing, for a solution that would require no signature and leave no blood on royal hands. But time was running out. Every day brought new terror, new instability, new fear that Sado would slaughter someone important, or worse, that his madness would spill beyond the palace and invite rebellion, shame, collapse. And still, the king refused to act. Because action was irreversible. Because judgment was divine. Because in the sacred geometry of Confucian kingship, the greatest sin was not cruelty, but disorder. And to act too early, or too harshly, or too publicly, would be to invite chaos into the throne room. So Youngjo waited for something else to rise. Something more ancient than politics, more terrible than madness, more irreversible than grief. He waited for ritual to justify what conscience could not. He waited for a mother to do what a king could not. And somewhere in the back of his mind, perhaps, he heard the scratching at the gates of his own legacy. Not from rebels or traitors, but from a son begging to be seen, a boy crying behind a cracked mirror, a name that would one day haunt history. Not because it failed to rise, but because it was never allowed to fall with dignity. It happened in the peak of summer, when the palace walls sweated beneath the sun and the air itself felt too thick to breathe. When even the birds grew quiet, as if mourning something not yet spoken. And the wind carried the scent of judgment through the corridors like a silent decree waiting to be read aloud. The decision had not come from a council, nor from the stroke of a royal seal, nor from a sword drawn in public view. It came from behind closed doors, whispered through layers of hierarchy and dread, shaped not by vengeance but by necessity, not by hatred but by the unbearable weight of saving a kingdom by sacrificing a son. There were no trumpets, no drums, no procession of guards or scribes. Only a plain wooden chest, lacquered in iron and built for storing rice. Large enough to hold a grown man, strong enough to hold silence. Lady Yongbin, his mother, the quiet woman who had borne him into this world without fanfare, who had obeyed every rule of palace life, with the devotion of someone who knew her bloodline was fragile and her position conditional, stood beside it, trembling not from confusion, but from the clarity of what had to be done. She did not speak. She did not plead. She did not collapse in grief or scream for mercy. Because in that moment, she was no longer simply a mother. She was a servant of order, a vessel for royal will, a woman raised beneath the philosophy that a single rotten branch must be severed for the tree to survive. And so, when the command came, not spoken by the king himself, but by the shadow of his silence, she did not argue. She nodded and began to weep. Sado was summoned. He came without shoes, without ceremony, without understanding. Perhaps he thought it was another test. Perhaps he believed, in some corner of his fraying mind, that this was a ritual of purification or exile, or even a symbolic death meant to appease the court while sparing his life. He looked around. He saw the guards. He saw his mother's face. He saw the box. But he said nothing, because by then, he had already learned that speech was dangerous and hope was a lie. Lady Hyeogyung was kept away, though she would later write that her son, young Jungjo, had been present, clutching the hem of her robe with a child's instinctive dread, eyes wide with incomprehension as his father, the man who kissed him and terrified him in equal measure, stepped toward a wooden box and knelt beside it, as if surrendering not to punishment, but to fate. There was no formal accusation, no reading of crimes, no condemnation, only the opening of a lid and the closing of all exits. Sado climbed inside. The space was narrow. The air was already stifling. The moment the lid shut, the guards fastened the iron hooks one by one. Not too quickly, not too slowly. With the precision of men performing a sacred rite they did not dare question. Then came the darkness. No food, no water, no light, no voice offering comfort, no priest whispering last rites. Only the wood, only the heat, only the breathing. At first, there was movement, scratching, muffled cries, shifting weight as Sado tried to turn, tried to plead, tried to wake from what he still hoped might be a nightmare staged for political theater. By the second day, he urinated on himself. By the third, he began to scream. Not words, just raw, guttural sound. The kind that strips the throat and bruises the air. The kind that makes walls flinch and memories ache. The palace staff were instructed not to respond, not to approach, not to document, not to open the lid. By the fourth day, the screams had turned to sobs, weak and confused, slurred by dehydration and illusion, punctuated by long silences that made the guards wonder, just briefly, whether it was over, and whether that might be a mercy. By the sixth, the box began to smell. Blood, vomit, waste, and something else. Something metallic and sour that clung to the air like guilt. By the seventh day, even the most hardened servants could no longer pass by without pausing, without looking at the ground, without wondering whether the silence now lingering from within the box was sleep or death. And by the eighth, it no longer mattered. When they finally opened it, either because the king relented or because someone feared the corpse would rupture. They found him twisted in a way the human body should not be twisted, as if he had tried, even in the final moments, to claw his way out. Not from the box, but from the sentence written into his name. His skin was blistered from heat. His lips were cracked, his tongue swollen, his fingernails broken. His eyes were half open, not in defiance, not in peace, but in the final flicker of disbelief, as if even in death he had not fully understood that it would end like this. He had not been tried. He had not been killed. He had simply been left to die by a father who wouldn't look, by a mother who closed the lid, by a court that needed silence more than truth. No monuments were raised, no tomb was prepared. He was not given the rights of a prince. His name was not spoken in public prayers. His death was not announced. It was recorded in vague language, hidden between phrases like "removed from court" and "peace restored to the palace," as if he had been an illness cured rather than a human being destroyed. But the palace did not forget. The walls remembered. The servants remembered. The mother who stood beside the box remembered. And above all, Lady Hyekyung remembered, writing years later with a pen sharpened by grief and fury, not to redeem a murderer, not to glorify a madman, but to ensure that what happened beneath those stone ceilings would never again be called mercy. She wrote it down. Every sound, every breath, every silence. Because someone had to remember that there was once a crown prince who died not by blade, not by poison, not by rebellion, but by the soundless ritual of a lid closing on a box in the middle of summer. A box that did not punish. A box that did not judge. A box that only waited. And in that waiting, devoured a life. He did not die all at once. There was no sudden gasp, no final cry, no burst of violence to mark the end. Only a slow, excruciating erasure of self that unfolded hour by hour within the cramped coffin of polished wood, sealed not with nails or chains, but with something colder, the silence of an empire that had chosen obedience over empathy, legacy over life. The first day passed in disbelief. The air inside the box was stifling, thick with the warmth of his own body, heavy with the breath he could not control. And as the sun burned overhead and sweat pooled beneath his limbs, he called out, not angrily, not even loudly, but with the fragile hope of a man who still believed that someone, somewhere, would listen. He whispered his mother's name. He called for his son. He waited for footsteps. But none came. The chest had no windows, no slats for light, no opening through which sound could travel clearly. It had been designed to store grain, not to contain a living soul. And yet that was precisely what it now held. A man who had once been a prince, now reduced to a shaking shadow of breath and bone, suspended in limbo between punishment and execution, between history and erasure. By the second day, the darkness had begun to bend. Not into shapes or hallucinations, not yet, but into pressure. A sensation that the air itself was thickening, that the walls were shrinking, that the wood was creaking not from weight, but from judgment, as if the coffin had begun to exhale its own verdict with every groan of heat-swollen timber. He began to sweat uncontrollably, his body unable to regulate itself under the crush of midsummer heat and starvation. And the silk robe he had once worn with princely dignity now clung to him like wet bandages, soaked in fear, fever, and the acidic scent of his own unraveling. On the third day, the thirst arrived with violence. His mouth cracked, his tongue swelled, his lips blistered. He tried to conserve moisture, to breathe through his nose, to press his face against the cooler sections of the box. But his instincts betrayed him. He panted, sobbed, screamed, and in doing so, accelerated his own dehydration until his throat no longer burned, but simply closed, the flesh curling inward like paper held too close to flame. He urinated where he lay. It soaked beneath him, hot and shameful. And as the puddle cooled, it mixed with the filth of his own body, creating a stench that filled the box and crawled into his lungs with every breath, turning each gasp into a punishment and each movement into a confrontation with the horror of what he had become. By the fourth day, he was not praying. He was not thinking. He was not remembering. He was merely existing, in flashes of panic, in waves of heat, in sudden jolts of pain when his body spasmed without warning, the muscles firing in protest against the slow betrayal of organ and bone. And somewhere in the palace, servants continued their duties. Chimes were rung, rituals performed, curtains drawn to block out the worst of the sun. But no one mentioned the box. No one approached it. No one dared ask how long it would take, or whether anyone inside could still hear. By the fifth day, delirium had begun to wrap itself around his consciousness like ivy climbing a dying tree. He hallucinated voices, some familiar, some invented. Lady Hyekyung's soft whisper, his son's laugh, even the voice of his father, not angry this time, but cold and calm, speaking not in condemnation, but in resignation, as though the judgment had already been delivered centuries ago and he was merely living through the echo. He clawed at the wood until his fingernails cracked. He bit his own wrist, not out of madness, but to taste something, anything, to remind himself that he still existed. And when the pain came, it was welcome, because it was real, because it was sharp, because it drowned out the greater agony of being forgotten. By the sixth day, the box began to stink in ways no palace was meant to endure. The lacquered wood, once pristine, now bore stains that oozed through the grain, and the guards stationed nearby turned their faces away, covered their noses with cloth, and prayed for the moment it would end. Not out of cruelty, but because they could no longer bear the smell of royal failure rotting beneath their feet. They were not told to open it. They were told to wait, to stand, to obey. And so they did, even as the scratching grew weaker, even as the moans grew quieter, even as the silences grew longer. By the seventh day, there was no sound at all. Some believed he had passed. Some believed he had simply slipped into unconsciousness. Some believed he was still listening, still waiting, still hoping. The box was not opened, not yet. It was left as it was, sealed and sweating in the heat, as though time itself had been told to hold its breath until the paperwork caught up with the morality. And by the eighth day, when the hinges finally creaked and the lid was slowly lifted, not by executioners, but by trembling hands assigned to sanitation, the lowest of the palace staff, what they found inside was not a prince, not a traitor, not a madman, but a corpse shaped by waiting, twisted not by torture, but by thirst, blistered not by fire, but by the sheer indifference of those who could have stopped it and chose not to. His limbs were drawn up, his spine arched, his skin raw from rubbing against wood, his eyes half open, his jaw clenched as if he had died not with a final breath, but with a question still caught in his throat, one that would never be answered, because no one had ever intended to listen in the first place. He had not died with honor. He had not died with clarity. He had not even died with certainty. He had died waiting. Waiting for a knock that never came. Waiting for a voice that never called his name. Waiting for a kingdom that had already made peace with the idea of forgetting him. And so they sealed the box again, not as a coffin, not as a relic, but as a secret. A quiet, unspeakable solution to a problem that had worn royal robes and asked too many questions. And the palace exhaled, as if relieved that the silence had returned. But beneath the floorboards, beneath the flagstones, beneath the memory of all who served him and turned away, something darker remained. A presence, a question, a truth that no box could contain. When it was over, when the final breath had dried into silence, when the box had been cleaned and the air inside the palace no longer carried the sour trace of death. No proclamations were made, no bells were rung, no banners lowered to half-mast, because the death of Prince Sado was not an event to be mourned, remembered, or even acknowledged, but a necessary silence swallowed whole by the machinery of monarchy that had learned long ago how to digest its own shame. The official records, carefully edited and reviewed by censors loyal more to the image of the crown than to the truth of its blood, made only passing reference to his disappearance, noting vaguely that the prince had retired from courtly duties and that peace had returned to the palace, as if the screams of a man dying in a box could ever be mistaken for serenity, or his legacy erased with the same ease as scratching ink from parchment. His name was omitted from ritual prayers. His absence was left unexplained in the imperial register. His death, while not officially denied, was never truly confessed, because to admit what had happened would not only force the court to confront the crime they had committed behind layers of legalistic restraint, but also risk unraveling the very philosophical scaffolding upon which the entire kingdom had been built. How could a Confucian dynasty claim divine order while hiding the fact that it had locked its heir in a rice chest and left him to die? How could a king be called virtuous when he had chosen silence over justice, distance over duty, and bureaucracy over love? The solution, as always, was omission. Erase the name, refuse the funeral, clean the chamber, seal the lid, and pray that the people would forget faster than the body had decayed. But time, while it dulls memory, does not absolve guilt. And years later, when the box had long since been discarded or hidden, when the blood had faded from the tiles, and when those who had witnessed the execution by silence had either died or gone mad, a boy became a man, and that man became a king. Zhongzhou, the son of Sado, ascended the throne not as a boy untouched by tragedy, but as a survivor who had seen his father dragged into darkness and suffocated beneath the weight of ritual, rumor, and rot. He had been there, not in the box, but near it, not in the decision, but within its shadow. And though his ministers urged him to move forward, to reign with clarity and not with vengeance, he could not forget the tremble in his mother's voice when she spoke of the 8th day, or the way the servants flinched when his father's name was mentioned, or the stain of silence that had followed him like a second skin his entire life. So he broke protocol. He ordered an investigation, not into the acts his father had committed, which had been chronicled in whispers and memoirs, but into the manner of his death, the absence of a trial, the decision made in quiet corners without accountability or courage. He restored Sado's name to the ancestral tablets. He bestowed upon him a posthumous title, Sado, meaning thinking with sorrow, a phrase heavy with duality, part mourning, part rebuke, part historical footnote carved with grief. He ordered rituals to be performed, not as a statement of innocence, but as an act of reclamation, an acknowledgement that his father had been a man, broken, yes, dangerous perhaps, but still human, still royal, still deserving of a story that did not end in rot and shadow. And yet, Even in this restoration, questions remained. Was Sado truly mad? Or was he made mad by the unbearable weight of expectation, isolation, and the brutal logic of a palace that saw sons not as children, but as extensions of policy? Had he been mentally ill? Was he a victim of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or some other condition that no one at the time had the tools or compassion to understand? Or had he merely been inconvenient? A disruptive force in a kingdom that demanded quiet airs and perfect appearances, a scapegoat for the fractures already present in a court drowning in its own doctrine? Historians debated, scholars argued. Modern psychiatry, centuries too late, speculated with the benefit of terms Sado never had: delusion, mania, trauma, abandonment. But the truth, buried beneath layers of shame and politics, remained as elusive as the final words he might have spoken in that box, before the heat took his mind and the silence took his voice. Lady Hyekyung's memoir, Hanjung-nok, offered no easy absolution. She documented his crimes, she recorded his violence, she acknowledged his terror. But she also preserved his grief. She described his tears. She recalled his kindnesses. She confessed her own moments of confusion, guilt, love, hatred, all tangled together in a portrait so human that it could not be dismissed as mere propaganda or defense. In her pages, Sado lived again, not as a hero, not as a monster, but as a man lost within the palace built to shape him, destroyed not in a moment of rebellion, but over years of loneliness, misdiagnosis, and the quiet horror of being watched by everyone and understood by no one. The box, it is said, was eventually dismantled, or burned, or buried. No one knows for sure, and perhaps that is fitting. For just as the kingdom could not decide what Sado had been in life, it could not agree what to do with the object that had become both his coffin and his judgment. But in the end, it is not the box that matters. It is the silence it created and the echo it left. A silence that haunted the throne for decades. A silence that bled into every ceremonial gesture, every moral lesson taught to future princes, every cautionary tale whispered beneath court breath. Because in Joseon, where fathers were sacred, where sons were duty incarnate, and where history was written not to tell the truth, but to preserve the mask of harmony, Prince Sado became the wound that never closed. Too monstrous to celebrate, too pitiful to condemn, and too dangerous to forget. He was not erased. He was buried. And sometimes, that is worse. She was not a historian by trade, nor a philosopher by title, nor a politician with ambitions to bend the court to her will. In fact, Lady Hyekyung had spent most of her life doing what palace women were trained from childhood to do: obey, endure, and survive with quiet grace, even as the world around them burned with decisions made by men who never once asked what it cost to bear witness. And yet, when she finally took up the brush to write Hanjung-nok, the memoirs of Lady Hyekyung, she did something no official scribe, no royal chronicler, no Confucian scholar dared to do. She told the truth not in numbers, not in legal terms, not in cold pronouncements, but in the language of lived pain, in the ink of sleepless nights, in the cadence of a woman who had spent years watching her husband become a monster and her child inherit the ashes. She did not flinch. She did not soften. She did not omit. She documented everything. The early signs, the tremors in his hands, the way he recoiled from books that once comforted him, the shift in his gaze from focused to frenzied, the subtle change in his voice from anxious to unhinged, the moments of silence that stretched too long, as if his thoughts were beginning to tangle in a place no one else could follow. The first acts of violence, striking servants over imagined insults, chasing shadows through corridors, demanding rituals for spirits only he could see, returning from midnight walks with blood on his robe and no memory of what he'd done or whom he had harmed. The murders, the rapes, the rage, the tears. She described all of it, not as a wife seeking to clear her name or protect her son's inheritance, but as someone determined to ensure that history could not say we did not know, that posterity could not look back and pretend it was all rumor, all exaggeration, all a tragedy of misunderstanding rather than a tragedy of complicity. And yet, for all its raw documentation of Sado's descent, the memoir is not a work of condemnation. It is not a eulogy. It is not even a plea. It is a reckoning. Because woven between the horrors are moments of unbearable tenderness. His affection for their son, his occasional flashes of clarity when he would look at her with eyes that remembered who he used to be. His apologies whispered in the dark after another violent episode. As if somewhere inside the ruined mind, there still flickered the soul of a man begging not for forgiveness, but for rescue. She tells of how he held their child with shaking hands, how he wept when he heard the boy cry, how he once tried to write a letter of apology to his father, but tore it apart before anyone could see it, muttering that ink was no match for judgment. She writes of the palace's silence, not just Young Joe's cold refusal to intervene, but the way ministers looked away, the way servants gossiped in whispers but never warned aloud, the way the entire system seemed more prepared to endure his madness than to understand it, more committed to preserving hierarchy than to offering help. In Hanjung Nok, the reader does not encounter a neatly categorized mad prince or a cartoonish villain, but a deeply broken human being caught in the jaws of expectation, ritual, and untreated illness, destroyed not in one act, but over years of slow, invisible disintegration. And what makes the memoir so devastating is not only that she remembered, it's that she refused to let the court forget. She preserved the sound of him screaming from the box. She described how the guards covered their ears. She recalled the way her son trembled when asked to speak of his father, even after ascending to the throne, even after restoring the name, even after the rituals had been performed and the body had long turned to dust. She knew what it meant to remember when everyone else preferred forgetting. And she did it anyway. Because memory, for her, was not an act of revenge. It was an act of justice. In Joseon, women were not permitted to speak in matters of state, not allowed to interfere with court politics, not encouraged to form opinions on royal governance. But by writing her story, Lady Hyeogyung carved a space where none had existed, not just for herself, but for every silent witness who had watched power consume a man and spit out a corpse without a name. Her memoir never blinks. It looks directly at the violence. It gazes steadily at the silence. It stares into the box. And in doing so, it forces the reader to confront what the kingdom tried so hard to bury. That madness is not a crime. That cruelty is not justice. And that no crown is worth more than a life unloved. She does not ask you to pity Sado. She does not ask you to absolve him. She only asks that you look, that you see him as she saw him. Bleeding, raving, dangerous, frightened, human. That you sit with the contradiction long enough to realize that even monsters were once boys in silk, raised with hope, crushed by pressure, and discarded when their usefulness became too difficult to manage. In the end, Hanjung Nok became more than a memoir. It became the trial Sado never received, the confession he never gave, the eulogy no one dared speak. It became the lid left ajar, the echo that refused to fade, the voice of a woman who had endured too much to remain quiet, and who understood that the only antidote to royal silence was the written truth. Unpolished, unfiltered, unbearable, through her pages, Sado remains trapped in the box, not to be shamed, not to be freed, but to be seen. And the question she leaves behind, unanswered but unavoidable, is this: if someone, anyone, had loved him differently, had reached him earlier, had dared to defy the rituals long enough to offer him something more than instruction, could he have been saved? Could madness have been interrupted? Could violence have been prevented? Could history have been written differently? She doesn't say yes. She doesn't say no. She only writes. And in that act, she resurrects not just a man, but a tragedy. One the kingdom will never be able to erase again. Long after the screams had faded, long after the blood had been scrubbed from the stones and the ministers who ordered silence had died beneath their own, long after the name Sado was folded into history with the polite vagueness reserved for dangerous memories, the echo of the chest remained. Not in sound, but in weight. Not in volume, but in the way the very idea of it settled over the legacy of a dynasty like dust that no ceremony could sweep away. There are palaces in Seoul today that still carry his name like a shadow cast by light too bright to look at directly. Memorial tablets inscribed with careful calligraphy, museum displays with softened words, textbooks that speak of instability and controversy, but rarely linger on the image of a man dying in a box, alone, forgotten, erased by protocol rather than blade. They say the box is gone. Some say it was burned. Some say it was dismantled and its pieces scattered so that no shrine might accidentally form, so that no future child might kneel before it and whisper prayers to a prince who never wore his crown. Others say it still exists, hidden in a storeroom, preserved like a relic, its wood warped by heat and sorrow, its hinges rusted shut not by time, but by guilt. But perhaps the box was never just a box. Perhaps it was the perfect metaphor for everything Sado's life became. A place built for storage, repurposed for punishment. A vessel meant to preserve life, used instead to contain decay. A symbol of nourishment turned into a tomb by a kingdom that prized harmony above honesty and ritual above mercy. Because that's what the chest held in the end. Not just the body of a prince, but the failure of a dynasty to reckon with the cost of its own perfection. It held the silence of a father who couldn't bring himself to look. It held the resignation of a mother who obeyed rather than rebelled. It held the fear of a court more terrified of disorder than of death. And it held, above all, the final breath of a man who, despite the murders, despite the madness, despite the rage, still died not as an enemy of the state, but as its most brutal creation. Sado was not poisoned, not stabbed, not exiled. He was not given the dignity of a final word or a public execution. He was not tried before the court or offered a chance to defend the fragments of his mind. He was made to vanish quietly, behind lacquered wood in the heat of summer, while the world outside continued to bow and kneel and recite the virtues of Confucian order as if nothing had gone wrong. And in many ways, nothing had. The kingdom continued. The court rebalanced. The throne passed to the son, who ruled with intelligence and strength and sorrow, woven so tightly into his voice that every decree felt like a whisper to a father he could no longer name aloud without history twitching. But the wound remained. not just in the bloodline, not just in the memoirs, but in the idea of power itself. What it demands, what it discards, what it dares to call justice when no one is brave enough to call it cruelty. Because Sado's story is not merely a tragedy. It is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when institutions value ritual over recognition, when fathers confuse obedience for love, when madness is treated as mutiny and grief as inconvenience. It is the quietest execution in Korean history, and perhaps the loudest injustice. A man who begged to be seen, buried by a system that taught its people to never meet the gaze of the broken. A son who reached for approval and found only policy. A husband who cried in the dark and was met with silence. A father who kissed his child's forehead with trembling lips, not knowing whether the moment would be remembered or feared. And now, centuries later, the echoes continue, not in the halls of power, but in the pages of memoirs that never blink. In the minds of readers who cannot forget the image of a man sealed in wood. In the quiet corners of palaces where shadows fall differently when you know what was once hidden beneath the stones. Because memory does not decay like flesh, it stains. And while history may rewrite the details, obscure the motives, sanitize the crime, there are some stories that persist not because they are repeated, but because they were once silenced too well. So when we speak his name, Sado, we do not speak it with forgiveness or with defense or with condemnation. We speak it with the weight it deserves, as a reminder that cruelty often wears ceremonial robes, that silence can be more violent than war, that a father's refusal to look can kill more surely than any sword, and that sometimes the box we use to hide shame becomes the very thing that defines us. In the end, Prince Sado was not remembered for what he did. He was remembered for what was done to him, not for the crimes of his madness, but for the quiet horror of a death decided by those too afraid to say the truth aloud. He died in darkness. He died in heat. He died in fear. He died in a box. But he did not die forgotten. Not anymore. He was many things, violent, broken, terrifying. But above all, he was abandoned. Prince Sado didn't just die in a box, he died waiting for someone to open it. And maybe that's the part we should remember most. Not the madness, not the politics, but the silence. Because sometimes, silence kills more completely than any blade.